Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'm chatting with my old pal, Peter Grandich. In this interview, we discuss the US debt and how there doesn't really seem to be any resistance from politicians to have any restraint from the situation that they're probably taking us down, which Peter throws a prediction of 3 to 5 years until we start to see all of this inflation start to really roar its ugly head. We also get into how young Americans and Canadians are able to deal with such a challenging cost of living situation with inflation roaring and wages seemingly not keeping up. We also get into how Peter thinks you can protect your wealth in a situation where the US dollar could be heading to zero. And I also sneak in a couple questions about the upcoming Super Bowl. All right, everybody, enjoy the interview. Peter, thanks for joining us today.
Always a pleasure. Haven't spoken in a while. Glad to see that handsome face of yours again.
Well, it's great having you back. I'd love to just talk about what's happening in football. Maybe we'll save that for the second half, and we'll get some of your predictions as we approach Super Bowl weekend. But first off, let's get into the recent news, particularly from a macro standpoint. Just last week, we found out that the Fed is expected to reduce their borrowing by a whopping $50 billion, taking it from $810 billion to $760 billion per quarter. Do you think that this reduction even really matters at this point?
Well, when it was announced, I actually took to Twitter to say, if you want to know how messed up Wall Street is and how blinded they are to the true economic upheaval that's coming because of what runaway debt is doing here in America and elsewhere around the world, but I'm focused on America, is that we would rally a couple hundred points because we're thrilled that instead of 820 billion to have to borrow for just 3 months, it's only going to be 760 billion only. And which of course at that run rate would still be over $3 trillion 1 year budget deficit. You know, Steve, I'm coming up on my 40th year celebrating when I first entered Wall Street. When I entered, there wasn't even $1 trillion of long-term debt. And it would be unimaginable to talk in T's for a budget deficit. And here we are with the Congressional Budget Office, not even 18 months ago, forecasting then that we're heading to 50 trillion in less than 10 years, and now have dropped a couple years off of that target. And we have Wall Street getting excited that because the estimate, which still can prove wrong, okay, is just the fantasy and the irregards to true, real, concerning factors that much of the financial service industry in the United States chooses to ignore. Because I know some of them know it. I know they're smart enough to know it, but they choose to ignore it because to bring it to the forefront and even put it as a possibility to be considered by investors, if they ever understood the reality of it, they would never have the same desire to buy stocks as they currently do.
So I'm looking at the usdebtclock.org. To our editor, Giorgio, if you can throw up a screenshot, go to usdebtclock.org and focus on that US national debt figure that's now north of $34 trillion. Now, my assumption when it comes to the debt is that the US gets to take liberties that the rest of the world doesn't, obviously because they're the world's reserve currency. And the reason that the world's okay with that is because, to a large extent, they play the world's police. And it's kind of a nebulous concept, spending massive amounts of money on US military just to effectively defend your dollar and your position as the world's reserve currency. But I look around at what's happening in the world, and we now have the Red Sea and the Suez Canal being blocked by the Houthis, which originally started with the Israeli conflict. And you can't help but wonder how much longer the US really wants to be in the business of being US world police. And I'm curious, you've been in this for a long time, following markets and following macro events. What do you think we should be thinking about in terms of trying to allocate our investment dollars in light of everything that's happening in terms of geopolitics? And I know that's a big question, but how do you think about it?
Well, let's cover that in two parts. Let's first talk about the debt itself. In 2019, which we already thought was a large number, it was just, and here we go saying just, 22 trillion. So in 5 years, we increased it by 50%. And if you think about it, we have budget deficits now. in the multi-trillion. So let's just say the CBO is pretty accurate. Somewhere within 7 to 10 years, we hit 50 trillion in debt. And let's just put a 4 or 5% interest rate on it. We'd be talking something about a $2.5 trillion interest expense. Steve, last year the United States had its best year ever in revenue, took in a little over $5 trillion. Now that'll grow a little bit in this 5 to 7 years, hopefully. But we'll be talking about half of all our income going for interest expense. You're a businessman. You know most businesses cannot survive with half their income just going to interest expense. Neither can the United States. Neither can it operate in the manner that people get accustomed to. To all the other issues, which I like to get back to, but let me address that second part, which is an important thing you brought up. There's an old saying in macroeconomics, at least we said it back in the 80s and 90s. Maybe people, old fogies like me, they don't look at that stuff anymore. But there was a great saying that whoever controls the seas controls economic trade. And the United States is not, and I underline not, the power it once was just 30 or 40 years ago. Militarily, nor is it accepted in the world in the way that it once was. And quite frankly, our Navy now, according to many world experts, no longer dominates. And with all that in mind, and as you point out, these flashpoints, and the biggest story in that, bigger than anything could be militarily, is that we have now nations in the world forming trading pacts openly to not lower their exposure to the United States trading with them, to have nothing to do with them. And that's only going to grow. And we're talking about BRICS. So all these things are happening coincidentally. And quite frankly, one of the reasons is they feel that we have not kept our house in order. It's out of control. And quite frankly, they've seen what the United States does, what it still thinks is its big thumb by what they did and how we left Afghanistan and left allies to fend for themselves, and how we basically what we did to Russia. And they don't want to be in that position. And that's another lead reason why they're forming these groups and looking to move away, which will include someday, probably at least 3 to 5 years away, at least an alternative currency, not saying it's going to replace the dollar as the reserve currency, but certainly a vehicle or vehicles to use to trade among themselves that are going to have some sort of hard asset, most likely gold, because that's why they're such big buyers of it. And that'll make the dollar, what's ever left of people believing it's the dominant currency, not to exist anymore. Not to exist as the dollar, but not to exist as the dominant currency.
Do you think that the challenge for investors to think about that are, say they have this belief that there's a big change coming, and it's for the first time, it feels like it's somewhat imminent. In the past, it's always like, okay, we're heading down this road. We don't really know, but when we look at what's happening geopolitically, it feels like we're getting closer and closer to some sort of major monetary event. You think that the challenge that a lot of investors are probably going to miss is that they think like, hey, I'm going to have time to react, but in reality, it's just going to happen so quickly that if you're not already positioned, you're going to kind of miss out on that opportunity to protect your wealth?
This discussion mainly takes place within people who are more attuned to things from hard assets, gold, macros discussions. If you tune in the typical chat, whether it's a YouTube channel or one of the major financial networks, what we're discussing isn't being discussed. And because of that, the general public, which mostly follows those groups, are not hearing about it or learning about it. And quite frankly, I suspect if you and I sat down and grabbed any 10 financial advisors from any part of the United States and started to talk about some of the things you and I could talk about, they'd all be looking on, what the heck are those guys talking about? Because it's just not in the makeup of the financial service industry. I call it the don't worry, be happy crowd. I say it sarcastically all the time, but I mean it seriously. They could be thrown off the top of the Empire State Building, and most of them all the way down will say the same thing. Hey, so far, so good. So I don't think what you and I have begun to discuss in greater detail is something that the average financial advisor to their clientele has a discussion with. Because I'll tell you why. I've come out with the most dire, Steve, I hate to prolong that part of your question, but I want to answer it, is I've come out with perhaps, not perhaps, the most dire forecast they ever made. I really think in 3 to 5 years, economically, socially, and politically, at tops 3 to 5 years, America will be in a situation rivaling what it saw itself in the Great Depression, but not have some of the benefits that it had in the Great Depression. One being that we were in a moral standard and willing to help each other. And what's driving it there is debt, a retirement and aging crisis. 65% of Americans are working paycheck to paycheck. An immigration invasion now, which just within a span of weeks has moved from an afterthought to one of the biggest concerns, and rightfully so. Most of those people, I'm not here to talk about the political aspect or if there's terrorists among them at all. Most of those people are coming just to escape a place where they think they can live a better life, but they're only coming with their shirts on their backs. They only bring liabilities. So they're only going to add to the weight that already existed here. The fourth is the BRICS. I don't think my remaining big time friends that are still so-called stars on Wall Street laugh and scoff when I talk about the BRICS. You're way overblown. There's no way it's going to be, and so forth. And I believe that they will rival the impact on world trade as the Industrial Revolution did. And then finally, the one thing you would think that could fix some of those or all the issues I just brought up to you is perhaps the biggest problem of them all, and that's political paralysis. We have two parties that not only cannot work together at all, but now they have fractions within each party that can't work with other members of the party. And they're going to be the people that are going to be called upon to fix this. And that's what's the scariest part of it all. And to me, Steve, it's only a question of when, not if now. We've passed that fail-safe point where you can say, well, you know what? We still have time to do something. We still have, no, we don't. And I really think that, and Steve, let me add this part. I don't sell anything in my planning group that benefits from that talk. Trust me when I tell you, when we sit down with 10 potential clients and I share what I just shared with you, 9 look and go, how can I get out that door? They don't want to hear that. So I can just tell you that I am the most concerned and really overly concerned than I've ever been in my 40-year career.
I I don't know what you're experiencing in New Jersey, but I'll tell you something about here in the Greater Toronto area, which is where I live. Um, I drive around the streets now, and I'm in suburbs of Toronto where there used to be no homelessness, and now you're seeing encampments starting to pop up everywhere, which used to be something you would only see downtown. When I was a kid, I grew up in a suburb of Toronto called Whitby, Ontario, and I believe that there was a town of 100,000 people, and I think that there was 2 homeless people 25 years ago. And now, if you go to any of these suburbs, there's dozens, if not hundreds, of people who don't have a place to live. And the other day, I'm on TikTok and I'm watching this mom talk about how she went into a Starbucks with her daughter, and she ordered a boring iced coffee and 1 cookie, and the bill came to like $13 or $14. And I'm looking around here and I'm saying, how does the math work here for how people are supposed to live in this economy? You know, you've got 2-bedroom apartments in not nice areas of Toronto that are now going for $2,500 to $3,000 or more a month. And for people who are in the bottom or the second or even the third quartile of income earners, the math just doesn't work. And I don't understand how all this can possibly end. Perhaps we're just looking at the end of Western civilization as we know it, and it's just more and more of the hollowing out of the middle class. But I don't know what it's like for you in New Jersey, but I'm looking around and I just don't know how the economics are supposed to work for the people who aren't in the top 1%.
So you bring up in that last thing that you said is perhaps the most important. So what's happened over the years, especially the last couple of decades, is we've seen a small minority, less than 10%, move way up, benefit greatly from what's happened. We saw from the COVID on, some billionaires be double, triple, quadruple, whatever their worth was. But by and large, most Americans have at best gone sideways, and a good kick of them have actually declined. And how we know that is not only is 65% of Americans working paycheck to paycheck, But we're finding studies coming out and seeing them where people making as much as 150,000 a year and are living paycheck to paycheck, have nothing saved. We're seeing almost 35% of Americans making less than 75,000, which basically, if you're making even less than that, it's beyond a struggle at this point. But they're now using credit cards just to pay for necessities, food, rent, gas. And remember, because of their credit status, their credit, and many of them making minimum payments, is somewhere between 20 and 30% interest rate. Steve, when I was younger, the only people that charged 20 or 30% were loan sharks. But now it's become very common, and they get behind the eight ball, can't get out, because what happens is once they don't make some of those principal payments and it builds up, they just can never make enough to pay it off. So they just keep paying the minimums, and the minimums keep going up. And this is at a time when government is completely out of control. I can't speak for Canada. I don't live there each day. I only go by what I hear in the news. But we have a government out of control in spending. We have a consumer that's out of control. We just again see it. People say to me, "How do they do it?" Well, everybody got excited. Wow, consumer spending's up 0.7%. The economy's strong. Personal income's up 0.3%. And I go, "Excuse me, they're spending $7. They're only making $3. Where are they getting the other $4 from?" And keep borrowing. And there comes a point where you get past the point of no return, and we're there now. And a lot of people don't want to hear it. I have three simple models now, Steve. One, we need to think of capital preservation versus capital appreciation. Yes, once you've preserved and know you can, and you still have monies left to seek opportunities to turn it into more than just an interest return, great. Two, less is more. It took me the first 20 years to learn that lesson. I lived my life, especially the last 20 and especially the last 10, not frugally, but in a lesson than I could. I can get a bigger home. I can get a more expensive car, and I can probably pay for it right now. But it would take away from securing things that are important for the rest of my life, my children, et cetera, et cetera. And then the last thing is, it's better to be now a live chicken than a dead duck. There's too many things that are risk oriented that can go wrong, and very few that can go right. And it's not a time to be a big risk taker, especially once you're like me with gray hair and no hair, because you just won't have the years to make up for it. If I'm correct about what's coming, even if only half of what I believe is coming, it's going to be very troublesome.
Yeah, and to your point about the credit cards, I spent some time looking into this, but we got these buy now, pay later programs that are suddenly embedded into every online store. And they don't really do a whole lot of background checks on people, and they don't communicate with the credit card companies. So you could have somebody who they've maxed out all their credit card debt, and they just found these new buckets of credit that they can borrow from via these buy now, pay later programs. And it almost makes me kind of think like, hey, we've maybe masked over some of our economic problems, at least for those bottom quartile people, because they found this little bucket to try to help them live for a few more months. But I look around and I go, at what point is there going to be people in the streets with pitchforks ready to start throwing rocks through windows because they just can't afford to eat anymore? And I when I look around and I just try to think about the math, it doesn't make sense to me. And I believe that a lot of what's happened is that there was people who, and I know that the US is a little different than us here in Canada, but there's people who bought houses or shelter, say 10, 20, 30 years ago. And for them, it's like, oh, things are really expensive. It's a lot more difficult now. But for the people who didn't go and buy houses, especially if they didn't buy it within about 5 years ago, the economics just don't work for them. And then I turn to my kids, and I assume you have grandkids, and I look to their future, and I don't even know what I'm going to tell them because we've got AI coming out. And do you tell them to go become a lawyer? Well, most of the stuff that lawyers do, I think AI is going to be able to reduce the need for a lot of that work drastically. Yes, we're still going to need lawyers, but the overall bucket of lawyers that we need is going to be a much smaller bucket because they'll have tools to make their jobs that much more effective. We can get into say even medical services. There, AI is going to find a way to reduce the amount of people needed for that. And then you think about like how do you raise your kids and prepare them for what the future is going to look like? And I can't think of a time in the last 100 years that's been more difficult or scary than right now.
Well, we're both in the same boat, although I don't see what's so bad about having less lawyers, but that's it for a discussion for another day. But going back to something you said in the early part of your statement, and that is we're now seeing how people are reacting because of what happened here with the immigration. See, when it first started, an American turned on its TV and saw, oh, look at these Texas and Arizona's being overrun, but they're the kind of being the people impacted. It's really not impacting me here. Then, as those state governors got smart and started to ship these poor souls, many of them are poor souls, around the country, uh, cities woke up that said, oh, we were willing to help everybody, like New York, and all of a sudden he said, can't do it. I can't handle it. But when it hit them now on a day-to-day basis, people are losing people with kids were taken out of school to home people, airports, buildings that were built for poor people, for homeless, for vets are now being taken over. Immigrants are being put in, and people learning that the government's going to carry their costs for a couple of years. And that's when it's now hit the streets. We've seen it on the south side of Chicago now, where people who were poor and really didn't say much because they still managed to get by. But now what little they got is they view as being taken by this immigration group. And it's really become us versus them. And that's what really is going to accelerate here. And that's why the Democrats, for the first time in just the recent days, are starting to call it a crisis. Even though the one and only reason in my eyes that they've allowed this is because they view it as a power grab. See, studies show almost 90% of illegal aliens or people that come as legal aliens, when they do enter the political spectrum, they enter it on the Democratic side. And I'm convinced that this was a decision that by allowing tens of millions of people in here undocumented is a power grab to assure a certain way of thinking, which goes against the way they think. I'm not here to say I'm right and they're wrong, but the way they think, the progressives and all, and how they see the United States should be going forward, and how people my age or my ilk see it is two different worlds. And that's why you have this, well, a MAGA or these Trump people, or even if you just talk like I did, that automatically makes you a Trump person. And then anybody that's over here is some super liberal. And you brought up a good point. There's no more middle class because there's no more middle ground. There's no more bipartisanship. Steve, we have been blessed with one of the rarest things you could possibly say in the United States. An honest and hardworking congressman. His name is Congressman Smith. He's been in Congress, I don't know, almost 40 years. He happens to be our congressman. He's only one of the two politicians I ever wrote a check for, and he only one of two politicians that I would sit around and listen to. And he told me, Pete, there's no way either side wants to work with each other. He says, in fact, I have problems with my own Republican Party now with things because there's certain agendas that they have that don't really fit what I believe the Republican Party should be. So it's a mess. The don't worry, be happy crowd, some of it knows it, some of it doesn't want to know it, and some wouldn't know it if it was staring in their face, but it's coming. And there's no turning back, Steve. You and I, if we both live, please God, the next 3 to 5 years, and we're still doing this, we're going to have a conversation. Remember, hey, Pete, remember back in 2023 and 24 when we said, boy, it really played out the way we said it. I'm absolutely convinced. I have no little hidden doubts, and I have no agenda because it helps me sell anything. It's just a fact of a life for me right now.
It's interesting hearing you talk about immigration because in Canada, we've even got, I'd suggest the problem much worse. And it's not to say that I don't like immigrants, but it's to say that there's a certain level that you can bring in and not screw up the standard of living for everybody else. And in Canada last year, we brought in 1.2 million immigrants. And the bulk of that is through international students. And the part that's really kind of concerning is that what'll happen is there's these recruitment agencies in places like India, and they'll convince one family that your one kid is great enough of a student that they can come to Canada and really succeed. And then they'll mortgage the family farm. They'll borrow from everybody they can to pay money to send that kid of theirs over to Canada. And in one case here, we were going through a college in London, Ontario called Fanshawe College. And it's a little different here in Canada than it is in the US. Fanshawe College would be the equivalent of a community college in the US. And they charge 4 times more for tuition for international students than they do for domestic students. Fanshawe College makes approximately $200 million a year. We can't get the exact figures. We got to make some assumptions, but they make around $200 million a year in enrollment revenue off of international students who really can't even afford to be here in the first place. And they're coming here and they're paying all that money towards an education that's not really going to get them anywhere anyways, because it's it's like, yeah, you're going to learn. That's great. But nobody's hiring people because they went to Fanshawe College, at least for the programs that most of these students are coming here for. And again, it creates these scenarios where if you go online and you look at rental availabilities that are out there, there's some people who are taking a house and they'll be like, hey, I'll rent beds now. It used to be you'd rent a whole house, then it turned into you're renting rooms. And now there's people that are actually renting beds. So you could go and rent and you have a bed and you're going to have 3 random roommates that you have to share that bedroom with. And then we also hear things like, hey, there's food banks are now turning down international students because there's just too much demand for food banks now here in Canada. I know I'm a broken record here, but I don't know how much longer we can go on with this until there are people in the streets rioting.
So we have, and I talked about it because my wife and I have made it one of our goals. We support multiple food banks, both locally and around other areas. And they'll tell you that it's tripled in the last couple of years, the amount of people showing up and the level of people working class and what they're earning to show up. So I used to consider Canada my home away from home. And I've always told people that if there was anything close to America, both as an ally and similar living and all, was Canada and the US. But to my Canadian friends who I don't see as I used to see, but I still talk to, we both agree on one thing, and probably you and I would hopefully agree, and that is if we both traded our leaders, we both would end up feeling we got the short end of the stick. So unfortunately, Canada got a leader group that kind of has gone the same way this administration has gone, very, very left, very far away from the things that once made what the country used to stand for and believe for both countries. And finally, it's getting so bad that people are speaking up, and you're wondering, is it too little, too late? I think we'll learn a lot from this coming election in the U.S. If that's the case, I think it's going to get very, very rough. I think it's going to get a lot more people divided than together. And even if there is a change and Trump is the president again, I tell all those that are big Trumpsters, I'm not, my wife is, I'm not. Don't get me wrong. If you ask me would I rather have Trump or Biden, and I don't want anybody to be confused, I'll take Trump. But I'm not a big fan. And sometimes I think if he did some of the same things he tried to do, but he did it in a different manner, he would have been more accepted. But if you think they hate him now, this is what I tell my Trump friends, and they've gone to these things of what they try to do to him to stop, and he still gets in. Do you think they're just going to say, oh, we lost and go away? So I don't see how even though we would feel good probably in that early election and some of the things he changes right away. But I think in a year or two, we could be looking at even worse problems because the other side would be so much more venom, if there's possible to have that. And the deceit that goes on now to find out the, the, there's no more honesty and integrity. I mean, I have a congressman, like I said, he says, Pete, I couldn't trust 80 or 90% of them, including guys in my home party. So I just think that it's you can't get around what's coming, and it may take longer. It may not happen in a year. It might be 3 years. Maybe it's even 7 years. But I think most people who are going to watch this in Canada, U.S., and wherever are going to be living to have to deal with this. And I'm going to tell you, 80, 90% of people have no preparation. And I'm not talking about preppers and going off somewhere so you can live off the land and all, are just living beyond their means. Steve, I'll tell you, to this day, just earlier this morning, a family that came in to seek our help in our planning group, and our family group is more about getting cash flow efficiencies, not trying to turn a dollar into four. Most families still live at least one level above where they should be. And their answer, their easiest answer to fix some of their issues was they needed to lower their life standard. They, between two kids and the husband and the wife, they have almost $4,000 in monthly car leases and loans sitting out in the driveway. And I said to him, you could actually, for what you're paying for those $60,000 to $80,000 cars and what you put down, you could have bought 4 used cars and saved $4,000 a month. And the first response was, and drive those clinkers. So that's just one of the many issues that come across. And Steve, I had it with the athletes. I had guys that were making $10, $15 million a year, and they were living like it can never end. And even those that got, and now of course all sports basically has become guaranteed contracts, but that wasn't the case for the NFL 10 or 20 years ago. And even there, and some of the guys who make a decent living playing, but they don't make 50 or 100 million, they don't realize as soon as they stop playing, their average income ability drops by 75 or 80%. But they built a lifestyle around that much higher number.
Now, you brought up how you used to work with athletes. I recall a couple of years ago, you mentioning that you worked with Joe Flacco, or I don't know if you worked with him or he was a friend. To change the conversation to sports just a little bit, I thought that Joe Flacco was the great story of the NFL this year. I actually put down some money on the Browns to win the Super Bowl. I thought that their defense was that good, combined with the Flacco story, that it just felt like the Cleveland Browns were going to win the Super Bowl and then go back to being terrible for another 50 years. What's your thoughts right now on what's happening in the NFL, and as we approach the Super Bowl in a week, who are you rooting for?
Well, I just wish Joe had a better personal game, because I think that is his last game. I think that is. I can't speak for him. I haven't spoken to him in quite a while. I'll tell you, I never enjoyed somebody on a day on a golf course that I've ever been with all the athletes than I did with him one day. But I've been watching football only because it's the playoffs, and I happen to be in the house of a guy that just recently went in the Hall of Fame. So I kind of have no choice but to watch it if I want to be around him and all. But hockey's still the one sport that I take time to watch and all, because it hasn't gone totally woke. The 3 other sports, particularly the NBA and the NFL, are just 100% woke. But that young man that's the quarterback for the 49ers, if you know his life story, he still lives with a roommate. He's a strong Christian boy, and I appreciate that. I wouldn't deny that that's the factor. But he's so humble. And here's a kid that's drafted as Miss Irrelevant, and that's what it is. It's just, you're happy you were the last and next to last, because at least you get a car. They give you a truck or something like that as the last thing, and a couple other gifts. But here he is in his second year, and who knows if he didn't get hurt last year, what would happen? He's playing for the Super Bowl against a team that, look, just in sports, I'm this way. Hey, you've been in it the last 4 or 5 years. Great, I'm glad you make it again. But I'd rather see somebody else win. But there's some conceitedness, particularly in their tight end, and even the quarterback now has gotten too big for his head in my book compared to what he was when he first came into the league. And people were tossing around this past week, and Brady did a wonderful job of putting an end to it, even though I'm not a Tom Brady fan, so to speak. To start talking about Patrick Mahomes is the greatest ever, and you got Tom Brady just retired after a year and did what he did. That's foolish talk, but that's what sports has come to. Sports is all business. I've told you this before. I spent 13 years around it with the New York Giants. I've seen the inner workings of sports. And that team at least had some caring about old players and things of that nature, but it's 100% make money. And you got people now that are not going to games because what they went to the games for to get away from what was happening outside the arena is now taking place in front of their eyes. And they don't want part of that, left or right. I just want to get away with it for a few hours. And the price, let me tell you what's coming, Steve. People haven't talked about this. NBC had such good fortune with this streaming that one game. I predict within 2 years, many games you're going to have to pay to see them. You're not going to be able to turn on and watch television to watch those games. And they're going to expand at least into Europe. There's going to become a London or something team in Europe, and even talk I know privately that's happening. They've been talking about in Mexico as well.
Yeah, that I assume that's coming. That there's going to be. It'll probably make the most amount of sense to just have a division in Europe. That way, if a team goes there and maybe they're there for 4 weeks, but it's still like you play once a week. It's not that long of a flight to Europe. I mean, when I fly to Portugal, it's what, like 6 hours or something?
Yeah, there's teams that have to go from New York to play in LA and vice versa. So, the time zone change may be different. But the cost of putting on sports is becoming so prohibitive at a time when we've just discussed how many people are struggling day to day. I have people here that say, listen, I can go take my kid to a Yankee game, buy 4 decent tickets, and between parking, food, and all, spend $600, $800, maybe $1,000. Or I can go down to our single A Philadelphia minor league team here, pay $12 for the ticket. And a lot of kids, especially when they're only 8, 10, and 12, they're just as excited to be there than they are in the other. Spend $100 that night and still walk that my kids are happy. And that's one of the things the sports is starting to move. It's going to price itself out from the average person. And that would be the beginning. It's going to be much tougher for them. That's why they're going for the streamline. While they got these big corporations willing to pay these dollars and all, that's why they're willing to do these deals, because they need that money. The owners, $3 billion isn't enough. I got to make another billion.
It used to work for the big cable networks, right? Like I remember when I first moved to Toronto, got my first job, and I signed up for a cable package. And for me to get the sports that I wanted, they made me pay for all these channels I didn't want, whether it was Home and Garden TV or the Women's Network or country music television, all these channels. I'm never going to watch these. Oh, but you got to get that package if you want to watch your sports. Whereas now all the cable companies are getting absolutely wrecked. I'm hearing from friends who work in media that the subscription rates that the cable companies pay the linear TV channels is just getting slashed by a huge number. And it would make sense that the only thing that really you're going to pay big money for these days, and it makes sense for cable networks, is live TV, because I don't want to record a game and then watch it the next day. I want to watch it live, because the second I pick up my phone, I'm going to have text messages or alerts, or I'm going to end up finding out. It doesn't work. So that's obviously the big cash cow in media right now. And we saw it with that Peacock NFL game where they made everybody download this app, and I think 30 million people still watched it.
Well, wouldn't you mind seeing the Toronto hockey team on delay? Wouldn't that be easier to accept?
Yeah, that's a whole side conversation. Peter, you've been very gracious with your time today. I really appreciate you hopping on here. For our audience, if they want more of your commentary, where's the best place that they can go to?
Well, for the 10% that is still standing after what we just discussed, and they want to hear more of that, they can find me, of course, at petergrandich.com. I do most of my work now, the majority of it on Twitter, and I also have a YouTube channel.
Well, we'll flash up those graphics so everybody can give you a follow. Thanks so much for doing this, Peter. It's always a pleasure when we get to chat, and I always look forward to it when you agree to come on here.
Thank you, Steve. God bless.
All right, everybody, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this interview, please smash that like button, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Also, let me know what you think in the comment section. Thanks, everyone.